Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on data exchange in electric power systems. So here as panelists, I would like to introduce Åsmund Jensen and Theodor Borche from THEMA Consulting Group. And I'm myself Mathilde Lallemand from ENTSO-E. So we would like today to present more in detail the report commissioned by ENTSO-E to THEMA on the European state of play of the data exchange platforms, so how it works and what are the perspective for such platforms. As an introduction, knowing the energy transition ongoing in our electricity system and market, the different new actors, the growth of renewables on the distribution level and transmission level, the new role of prosumers and new services which are appearing, smart grids and innovative markets will rely more and more on extended data exchange. So today, digitalization is like a buzzword we use a lot, which encompass a lot of aspects. And in these aspects, smart meters rollout, data display transparency, data exchange, use of this data to foster new services is full part of it. So in that sense, it was a motivation for ENTSO-E to commission this study done by THEMA on the data exchange platforms, which are what are these hubs, which are today appearing in some European countries. What is the status today of these kind of platforms? Where are they existing? For what? So which kind of data are they gathering? Which actors are they targeting? And which functionalities they are aiming to fulfill? How they can bridge somehow the gap between the retail and the wholesale markets, and what could be further functionalities, further perspective for such data hub. So I would like now to leave the floor to Åsmund Jensen and Theodor Borche for them to present more in detail the study which has been made on these platforms.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mathilde. As you introduced, my name is Åsmund Jensen, and I'll start by introducing some of the issues that we have worked on for ENTSO-E, and then my colleague Theodor will take over later in the presentation. So I guess we can just start by just as Mathilde also mentioned, we have had the main objective here is to contribute with some facts to the discussion about data exchange platforms. And to do that, we have tried to answer 3 specific questions. Where the first is what are, at a generic level, without referring to how things are actually done in practice in different countries, what are the data requirements of different stakeholders in the electricity sector, in the transmission and distribution grid, and in different markets for energy and related services. And the second question, where we then look at in more detail how these things are managed in European electricity markets today, we try to give a picture of the status with regard to the development of data exchange platforms. And then finally, we try to look a little bit ahead on how data exchange platforms can be developed both in the short and the long term to meet the needs of different stakeholders and the EU energy policy objectives. But we'll start out by looking at, as I said, from the generic level, then what do different actors need from of data. And our starting point is that the regulatory environment is really a main driver for data exchange requirements. And of course, you are all aware of the clean energy package and the electricity network codes that are being developed. We have both from a directive, from the draft directive of the internal market of electricity down to the regulations and then specific network codes. Out of that, we see that there are kind of two or three main points here. One of them is the role of the consumer, that the customer should be empowered to participate in the markets. that they should have the right to own their own data and have access to everything they need in order to participate efficiently in the market. And then another line of development here is the integration of the wholesale and retail markets, where this developing regulatory environment is really drawing a picture where you need much more cooperation between DSOs and TSOs in order to balance the system, where you also want to include distributed flexibility to participate in wholesale markets, to manage congestion and other network issues. And finally, there's also the regulatory authorities. If they are to monitor both the market and also the grids in a proper manner, they need access to quite a lot of data. So the main picture we're drawing here is of a regulatory environment where the role of the consumer is changing, the integration between the DSO and the TSO level, and thereby also the retail and wholesale market is changing, and you also have the needs of the regulator. And all these factors drive together change the need for data on the part of different stakeholders. And also it should be said that this report that we're doing, it is by no means the first work in this area. We have looked at quite a few other reports, for instance by the European Smart Grids Task Force called My Energy Data, where the focus is very much on customer data, customer services and retail markets. We have the power sector that goes digital by Eurelectric, which also has a focus on retail markets and the digitalization of the power system in more general terms, both with regards to customer empowerment, the role of the DSO in managing the system, and finally also the TSO-DSO data management report, which was done by ENTSO-E, Eurelectric, ENTSO, CELEC, and Geo, where the perspective is broadened a little bit, where the wholesale retail market interface is an issue that's highlighted there, and where they go through various applications and use cases where this interaction between TSOs and DSOs and the necessary data exchange is analyzed in some detail, both with regard to congestion management, balancing, use of flexibility in the distribution grid to manage issues in the transmission grid, etc. And we're trying to build on that by continuing to sort of expand the scope, not just from retail markets, but also then to the DSO, TSO, and wholesale retail market integration. And I think one observation we draw from this report is that there seems to be developing a general agreement on the basic principles on what constitutes good data exchange. And it has to do with privacy and data security, obviously. The fact that you should, that this data systems in the power sector should be secure from outside intervention. As a customer, you should be able to trust that your personal data are treated in the proper manner, and it's not available to everyone. It's necessary that data exchange facilitates competition, markets, and innovation. The principle of neutrality and non-discrimination, for instance, that no one should have a sort of privileged access to data and be able to use that for distorting competition. Everything should be neutral. Transparency of the data exchange. The stakeholders in the market should have confidence that the data are treated in accordance with these principles, and that whoever needs to know anything about the way this data exchange works should have access to that information. The regulator should be able to monitor what's happening, which links on to the next point on transparency in the power sector. Data exchange should be done cost efficiently and as simple as possible, because there are large economies of scale with regard to IT systems and data exchange, and organizing data exchange in the proper manner is then important. And finally, we have the issue of harmonized standards which is essentially a technical issue that data models and data formats are so that the different stakeholders can actually exchange information and talk to each other in the proper manner. So as I said, this is kind of what we learned from this, going through both the regulatory developments and also the various reports that have been produced. First of all, the requirements on data exchange are expanding, and also that both at the retail level itself, but then also when you consider the integration between retail and wholesale. And finally, that there's, as we see it, developing a common understanding of the criteria for good data exchange. And before we go into the state of play, which Theodor is going to talk about, I'm just going to briefly give a short overview of what types of data we're actually talking about here. And again, this is at a generic level. We're not saying here that these are data that should be stored or be available from a central exchange platform. These are the data you need from different stakeholders in order to both participate in the market, operate the physical power system, and also meet different types of legal requirements. And we have used your electric report as a starting point here for classifying different types of data. We have, for instance, meter data, which is consumption data and production data at each point in the grid. The address of the customer, the ID, whether that's name or something else, the geographic location, the type of contract, and finally the balance group. And those are data that are needed for both traditionally for DSOs and suppliers in order to sort of build their customers and have an idea on the DSO side, for instance, what is the development with regard to consumption and production in different parts of the grid, which is important both for operations and planning. But we're also starting to see energy service companies, aggregators, and other players, and also the customers themselves, of course, have the need for this data in order to enter into the type of contract that's most suitable for them, so that these processes related to switching supplier, moving in and out to new locations, etc., that they can be handled efficiently. Moving on to the grid data, where you have obviously the TSOs and DSOs have a need for that. We're talking about here planned grid configuration, planned maintenance, outages, grid expansions, also historical measurements and real-time data on the state of the power system. These are also data that are necessary for both consumers, producers, and also aggregators in order to have information on how they can sort of participate in balancing the grid and managing congestion, etc., to contribute towards increased efficiency. And finally, we have the more or less residual category of market data, which is basically everything you can think of that's not meter data or grid data. It could be spot market prices, it could be generation data from the wholesale market, it could be production and consumption schedules, even at unit level. It could be weather data that could be relevant, appliance data as we move to the Internet of Things, and more applications are online and can be controlled from afar. And this is really an area where the data needs are developing quite rapidly, and where there are new opportunities due to the digitalization of the sector, and also new business models, new actors coming in, again, aggregators, ESCOs, etc. And this is also very much related to the wholesale retail integration issue that we are going to come back to. So in summary, we have some regulatory drivers that increase the need for data exchange, increase the needs for quality and efficiency in these processes, where we have both existing and new stakeholders that have some requirements both with regard to data quality and the type of data that are accessible to them. So on that note, with that background, we can start by looking at the state of play as it is in Europe today.
Yes, and here I'll take over. Good morning also from me. Welcome to this talk. We looked at quite a few data exchange models in the different countries in Europe, and we see that there's a very varied landscape across Europe. So we have some countries which use standardized data exchange, but point to point, so each supplier has to talk to each DSO to get the metering data that they need. So this model, for example, it's very strong in Germany and Austria, but also in Portugal. We see in those countries also that it was very important that it's a strong standardization, but I will come back to that at a later point. We see then with the countries which have central data exchange or discuss central data exchange that there are quite different models also for that. So we have some countries where there is a central point of access, but the data is still stored decentrally at the DSOs. So this was, for example, the case in Belgium and the Netherlands. We have countries which are currently implementing central data exchange platforms. That happens here in the Nordics, in Norway, Finland, and Sweden right now, but it's also happening at other places like Spain. And Belgium, for example, is a country which is now going from a more decentral system to a more central system. And then many countries are currently discussing if they should introduce a central data exchange platform. For example, in France, the biggest DSO there, which covers 95% of the metering points, is planning to introduce something like a data exchange platform. In Switzerland, there's an ongoing discussion started by the industry, and the ministries are now analyzing if they should do it. But also in the Eastern European countries, we see more and more discussion of that. After Estonia already introduced a quite modern, very modern data exchange platform. So we also see a difference in the countries concerning if customers can actually access their own data. This is something that seems to be mostly the case in the Nordic countries and in the UK. Quite interesting split there, but this is a very important point that we will also look at in more detail in the next slides. So we've seen that there are quite different systems for exchanging data, but what is also very important to point out is that we see that countries are moving from decentral data exchange to more centralized data exchange. So in all the countries that we looked at, we did not find a single case where it was in the other direction, where a central data exchange platform was abandoned in favor of a decentral system. But we see many cases of countries going from decentral to centralized. And we also see countries which do it in a more stepwise fashion. So having first a central point of access with decentral data storage, and then continuing to also central storing of the metering values. There are many different models how that works, but it's important for us to point out this trend which we see, which hints at the fact that there are indeed quite some benefits that are gained by centralizing the data exchange in terms of efficiency or costs also. We see also some countries like Denmark where there are now updated versions of the data hub. So there was first a version, and then a few years later, this more experienced, that data hub was replaced by a basically completely new data hub, even though the general data exchange model did not change. So this would not have happened if the people would not have been convinced of that system. So we have then in the report, in quite a lot of detail, tried to collect a comparison of different data exchange platforms across Europe. That are a lot of tables that we have also in the presentation. I will not go through every single element in there, but maybe to point out a few main findings that we have. So in the countries that we compare, we have one country without a central data exchange platform, that is Germany, with a standardized decentral data exchange. And then we have other countries which have or are currently implementing a data exchange platform. We see, for example, here on this slide, it's quite important for us to point out that there are different models for who is actually owning and operating the data exchange platform. but that in all cases it's the TSOs, DSOs that are involved in some way in there. There is, as I said, there are different models in different countries. Sometimes it's a TSO which both owns and operates the data exchange platform. Sometimes the TSO is the owner with the platform as a subsidiary company, or sometimes it's the DSOs that own it and then a own company that is operating it. We think it's quite important to point this out. We also see one reason for the TSOs usually being involved is that they are seen as a neutral party. So what we do not see is, except maybe in Ireland, is a single DSO operating the system, because if there are several DSOs in a country and one would operate the system, that would raise concerns about the neutrality. When we also look further at what kind of data is on there and what kind of metering points are included, there are quite some differences that could be made. So, for example, is it focusing on the small customers connected to the DSO, or is it all consumers also on the high voltage level that are connected, which is usually the case. We also see that most of the platforms handle quite a large number of metering points. And it's also interesting to point out that in the Netherlands, the gas metering is also included on the data hub, and other countries are considering similar approaches. Obviously, the whole point of a data exchange platform is to make metered and master data available, so that is possible on all of them. And the load profiles, that is a bit more difficult because it depends on if they're actually being measured or if they have to be profiled. And depending on that, if there is a smart meter rollout or not, and if they're profiled, there are different models on if that is available or not. So if you only get the yearly measurements or monthly measurements, or if you also get the actually load profile that you can use for your bidding. Another very interesting point is that there is, of course, a synergy between smart meters and data exchange platforms. So if you have all that smart meter data, it makes sense to have a data exchange platform where you can efficiently exchange that data, where also the third parties or customers could access that data. But we also found that smart meter rollout is not a necessary precondition for a data exchange platform. Nor the other way around. So we have some examples of countries where we do not have a full smart meter rollout, and we still have data exchange platforms. Very interestingly, the first data exchange platform in Europe that we found was actually in Iceland quite some time ago, and still today they only have yearly meter readings for the small end consumers. Still, they saw a big benefit in having that central exchange platform. But still, of course, if you have smart meters and you have a data exchange platform, it gives you quite a few benefits. And the final point that is interesting, especially with the side toward prosumers, distributed generation, is the question if production data is also handled. If only large production data is handled or only small data, and so on. That makes the difference in the end what you can do on those platforms. Also, if you look, for example, at green certificates, certificates of origin for decentral production, renewable production. And final table is the scope, the metadata that is stored on the data exchange platforms. And especially here, I want to focus on if customers can access their own data. This is very interesting if you, for example, want to get the quote by supplier. If you want to have a new contract, you could send your data to that supplier to get an offer. Some platforms also allow that measured or metered data is directly communicated to a new supplier who wants to make an offer with the authorization of the customer. And here we actually see a quite important element for competition in the market. So if you allow this kind of data exchange, it could be very good to increase the competition between suppliers and to enable customers to make a more informed choice about their supply, but also to enable customers to understand their own consumption better and maybe make some decisions on energy savings that they otherwise would not be able to make. And then also some last questions, is market data on that platform available? So here Estonia is very far in the front, so customers can actually get quite a lot of data like spot market prices, weather forecast via the data exchange platform, and could use that to adjust their demand to the current price and maybe also to their expectation about their own production from a solar cell or their own heating demand and so on. And to make that easier for customers, Estonia also allows external applications to run on that data, always of course with the authorization by the customer, that can help customers make good decisions that they could maybe not make themselves. So they're very interesting developments, very innovative things that you could do if you actually have these kind of functionalities available on a data exchange platform. So in the report, we also looked at 4 case studies in a bit of more detail. They're in detail described in the appendix. We chose 4 countries. That is Germany with a decentral data exchange. It's the Netherlands, where we looked at the first version of the data with the decentral data storage. It's Norway, where we have a central data exchange platform and a focus on also now the imbalance settlement. And we have Estonia, where we have a central data exchange platform, and as I just mentioned, also a big focus on the customer access and customer rights. In all these countries, the main driver for implementing a data exchange platform was very clearly a lack of data quality, and also issues with the market functioning. So new suppliers had big difficulties in actually connecting to all the DSOs in the country and actually receiving the data that they needed to run the business. And to make that more efficient and to reduce the market barriers there, that was a very clear motivation to implement these data exchange platforms. And we see again that there are different functionalities and data types stored with a different focus of the different platforms. The left table is quite similar to what we have seen before. So of course, consumption and production data is available. The meter master data is always available, but a very important point is that the data authorization, the access to the data for third parties, that is very difficult to implement on a decentral data exchange as we see it in Germany. So in Germany, we have a very efficient data exchange nowadays between the suppliers and the retailers, which was the focus of the strict standardization, which was also binding by law. So if a DSO does not comply with these standards, they have to pay a fine. So we have that which enables actually the efficient data exchange between the supplier and DSO, but we cannot in Germany, for example, give a customer access to the data over that central platform. So he has to go to his DSO directly. And that prevents certain things from being done in Germany, which you could do on a centralized data exchange platform. We see in Norway the focus on the imbalance settlement also. So there currently is not planned to have spot price data or weather data on the platform. And as we discussed before, this is a very clear difference to what we see in Estonia, where it's really the focus on enabling the customer. So in Norway, the main driver there was still the efficiency of the market processes, and that not only on the retail side, on the connection between the supplier and the DSO, but also on all the balancing related issues and exchanges between the TSO and the suppliers in that. And then we have the functionalities. The data access for the customer, again, this is something that is quite difficult for to implement in a decentralized data exchange, but it's possible on the more centralized data exchange platforms. But otherwise, all these platforms support the basic retail market functionalities like switching, efficient switching, having a bill by the supplier, and so on. Okay, so if you are interested in more details in this, please refer to our report where we have a very detailed description of the four use cases. So to come to the main findings of the current state of play in data exchange, the biggest driver for data exchange platforms was efficiency, the removal of market barriers, and also lately is empowering of the customer. So data exchange platforms were really needed in a lot of markets because after the market opening, after liberalization, there was an issue with the data quality. And one thing that very commonly happened is that, for example, you had a data set for a customer, it's a DSO and it's a supplier. And if now, for example, the customer married and changed his name, he might have informed his DSO, but not the supplier. And suddenly those data sets were not consistent anymore. And these issues with consistency, they created a lot of problems, and these problems grew over the time. And that was a very big reason to have a central database for the master data for the customer data. And the other big issue there is that the neutral access to the data. So if you have a supplier which was formerly integrated with a DSO, usually the connection into the data exchange worked very well. But if you had a new supplier that came into the market and he did not have this good connection to the data of the DSO, that made it much harder for him to run his business, to get the data he needed, to get the metering data, and so on. And this, of course, created a huge market barrier. So this neutral access to data was a very, very big driver, both for centralized data exchange or also for much more standardized decentralized data exchange. Then, of course, we need transparency with respect to the processes, access rights, and responsibilities. And again, this is much easier to guarantee if you have a central platform where the rules are clearly defined and where everybody respects the same rules. And another improvement in the efficiency is that just the number of interfaces is reduced. So each supplier has to connect to only one point to get the metering data instead of connecting to each and every DSO in the market. So, and of course, if you improve the efficiency, it's always a removal of market barriers. So these market barriers that were reduced by, for example, allowing easier switching and hence increasing the market functioning, making it faster also for customers to switch and less costly. It's reducing the cost for a supplier to participate in a market by just having a single point of access and just having one clearly defined standard on how to connect there instead of connecting to many different points which may have different communication standards that they require request. And it's also helps if you have clear rules for the data availability. So if the data has to be on the data hub by a certain point in time, it's very easy to check that if you have a central exchange platform. So even if you have these clear rules in a decentral data exchange, it's just much harder to enforce them, because basically every time that the data is not there available on time, the supplier would have to complain to the regulator. While if everything goes through a central data exchange platform, you can very easily monitor on that central platform if every party, both the suppliers and the DSOs, comply with the requirements on availability of data. And then finally, empowering the customers. So having access to your own data and granting access to third parties is a very important way to give customers, small consumers, more power in the electricity market, because they can easily understand their own consumption, because they can easily get new offers that fit to their actual demand profile. And all of these things are much easier implemented if you have a central point of access to that data, again, than if every DSO has to implement a system that would allow that. It's also, if you think about larger consumers like retailers, supermarkets that have demand in a lot of different grids in a country, for them it's a huge issue if they have to connect to each DSO to get the consumption data. So also for them, it's the centralization and reduction of interfaces is a huge benefit. So what we find is that we have a clear trend towards centralized solutions. We need interoperability, at least within each country, but ideally we would also like to see that across borders, which also is a big topic in the Nordic countries, where the wholesale market is very, very integrated, but now it's still slightly different rules in the retail markets, making it harder for for suppliers to set up business in a neighboring country. So there, the interoperability is a very big benefit that we would see in the next years, and which is of course absolutely mandatory within each country. And we also see on the governance side that the exchange platforms, they're usually operated either by the TSO or by a group of DSOs, always with the neutrality of the operation in mind. So now we have discussed quite in detail what we see as the current state of play, what has happened and why it has happened. So we also have some statements to make on how this could develop in the future. We would very much like to point out that these are ideas, that we don't in any way want to mandate that anything of this has to be implemented, but there are many interesting options in how data exchange could be used in the future in a more broad way than it is used today. So of course, the reduction of market barriers, the existing data exchange platforms did a huge step in that, but that is also something that we can continue to see in different ways in the future. And that's wherever there are still market barriers, looking at the data exchange is a good option, and you should keep that in mind. If data exchange, more standardized or centralized data exchange could benefit that, then you should use a data exchange platform. And the important point here is to reduce the number of interfaces for market participants, to have a neutral institution that is overseeing the data exchange, and also to enable new services and innovation through easier access to data. We always want to point out that access, of course, has to happen with the consent of the customer. Then we have certain topologies where data exchange platforms are just naturally useful. So that is if the same type of data is exchanged between many actors, as is the case, for example, with metering data. But also if you have high requirements on the data quality and data availability and the quality of the processes that are connected to that. You always need a data exchange platform that the market actually trusts. So the market participants need to believe or need to be convinced that their data, if they store it on the data exchange platform, that it is handled in an appropriate way so that no competitor gets access to the data. Also for the customer, that only the parties who have the right to access the data can access it. That is very important. And also, of course, that's the data quality on the data exchange platform. It's very important that you have good quality data there, so that the market participants can actually use it without doubting the quality, and then otherwise you don't win too much. But generally, we see that the data exchange platform improves the data quality because it can enforce timely data provision, and it can enforce a certain standard of provision, and it can also be used to monitor the data provision. And finally, as we discussed previously, also the interoperability is extremely important. So that on the one hand concerns data formats and standards that you use for the data exchange. It also concerns the available functionalities on a data platform. So if you're a supplier, a retailer, and you have a certain set of functionalities in one country, if you go to another country to provide your services there, you also would like to have similar functionalities there. And then, of course, that ideally also works across not only one country, but across the European Union. And a very big topic right now is also the sector coupling between, for example, heat and electricity, or transport, mobility and electricity. And it would be great if the data exchange platforms or data exchange models can also take interoperability between sectors into account. Generally, what we also see is that we can use data exchange platforms to improve the integration of the wholesale and retail markets. So already today, the customers, I mean, they get a price by a supplier, and the suppliers then buy and sell electricity on the wholesale market. But with an improved data exchange, the customers could actually get real-time information about the market and get spot-based contracts. They could participate either directly or via an aggregator in balancing and energy services and so on. Probably all of that would still not be that customers directly go into the wholesale markets, but this exchange of data, this exchange of information enables them to act in a way that is in line with the current wholesale market situation. And that is something where we see a huge benefit of data exchange generally. Exactly in those three cases, so spot-based contracts, giving an incentive for customers to consume electricity if it's cheap and available. Participation of small generation and storage in wholesale energy markets directly or through aggregation, and the same also in the flexibility services, balancing markets or other kinds of flexibility. But for all that, again, it's very important that the data exchange is managed in a very efficient way. So we started the presentation with 3 different types of data. We listed a few services or functionalities that could be on an exchange platform. Most of the platforms are focusing on the retail functionalities, but generally we could extend the data exchange platforms or have additional exchange platforms that also look at the other types of data and related services. And considering that we also want to answer some questions if you have them, we would like to continue with the conclusions. We have seen drivers for data exchange, that is to empower customers and better integrate wholesale and retail markets, to enable distributed demand, storage and generation, to offer flexibility into those markets. Very importantly, to reduce market barriers and increase efficiency in markets, and also to foster innovation and support energy service companies in creating new services for which they usually need access to data in some way. With the current state of play, we've seen that existing DPs, data exchange platforms, were driven by mainly the reduction of market barriers for new entrants into the market, by more efficiency in the processes, which became very costly after the market opening, and by improving data quality for the market participants. We see also that there's a persistent trend towards the more centralized platforms that we observe in Europe. We have seen the data exchange platforms in the countries where they have been implemented. They have increased the efficiency of the market processes. They have given neutral data access to suppliers, new suppliers, especially in the market. And where customers can access the data, it's also improved the customer rights and customer information. We also see that there is no one-size-fits-all system design. So each country came up with their own design. with some specifics that are related to what was needed in the country. But what we do see are common criteria for the data exchange. So that was the neutrality, non-discrimination, transparency, privacy, security, and so on. All of these. And with the governance, we see that it's some neutral organization, either a group of TSOs or the TSO, or a completely independent state-owned entity, usually, that operates this data exchange. And finally, on the possible future development, we see a huge benefit to increase the scope of data on the exchange platforms to market data, where then more services could be offered to customers. So especially spot market prices, weather data, that could be very interesting for consumers that want to participate more actively in the energy markets. To guarantee the trust into the data exchange, it's absolutely paramount to have neutrality and trustworthiness and also interoperability of the data exchange, because only if that is a good experience for the market participants and for the customers will that data exchange platform be really accepted widely. We see that these data exchange platforms can support the wholesale retail integration in many different ways. We might see in the future more close to real-time data provision. So by that we mean that the smart meter data might come to the data platform within a few minutes after it's actually been read, rather than maybe on the next day or second next day as it is today on many platforms. We do not see this as an alternative to the current real-time SCADA systems that exchange data between TSOs and DSOs. But prices and also metering data that is communicated close to real time could further improve the kind of services that could be offered through such a platform. And also a big topic we think in the future will be the cross-border data exchange and the interoperability of data platforms, not only within the country, but across Europe between the countries. Okay, I hope you enjoyed our presentation, and we would be very happy if there are some questions. So please let us know.
So there are indeed some questions gathered in the chat. So I think Osmund, you can also see them. So a first package, I would say, of questions around meter data and the fact that they belong only to the customers. So how finally is it possible for a central data platform to share this data? So I think you gave us some insight about the fact that the consumer may allow for this transaction beforehand, but could you please maybe elaborate a bit more around this and how customers can display the data to this data exchange platform without violating any law?
Should I answer that, or should you want to? Yes, I'll try to expand a little bit on what we have seen in different solutions, at least. That I think the question points to the fact that you really need you need to think a lot about the security arrangements and in these hubs and the authorization and access regime, and that's also what we see in practice. That that's something that these hubs spend a lot of time on and a lot of effort and costs. I think the main with regard to the customer and the fact that they own the data at the outset, you need some sort of regime then for authenticating who is actually having access to it. If you are the customer suppliers, of course you should have access to it, and the customer may also have you may have some sort of authorization regime where the customer via the hub gives the okay to different third parties, and the hub must then of course be in the middle here and check that the requests are authentic and that the customer responses are proper. with the second part of the question on what was that again? Is there anything else we could say about?
Yeah, maybe one example from Denmark. So in Denmark, you can, as a customer, give a third party access to your data via the hub. But the hub also makes data, metering data available in different levels. So you can get aggregated data as a private person. You can, as a researcher from a legitimate research institution, you can also get anonymous metering values from individual households. But there it's very clear that you cannot, you do not get the customer whose data that is. You just get the load profile from single households. And only after they've been audited basically as being eligible as a researcher to do so. So there are different ways in which this data could be made available, and of course there are privacy laws. There's the data protection regulation from the European Union, which has to be respected in all cases. And it's mainly about the customer really giving his consent to the metering data being available to one specific third party. That is how we see it.
Thank you for this answer. We then have a second package of questions around what would be the idea. So it's a questions addressed more to ENTSO-E apparently. So I would take it. So what are the best or desirable functionalities of data exchange platforms, and what could be the perspectives in that respect, and what are the recommendations? So here, as ENTSO-E, it's not here. The idea is not to issue a recommendation on a one-size-fits-all model. Really, not at all. The idea of this study was to provide a clear view of what is existing today, and indeed, as it was detailed in this presentation, to give some proposal on further perspectives and functionalities linked on the state of play today and the further needs. So we believe that the data exchange platforms could be of great value for more integration between retail and wholesale markets, and also data available on these markets to foster new services. As we saw in the tables describing the content of the data exchange platforms, some of them already gather both data from retail and wholesale, trying to bridge a gap between these two markets. And it could link to new services, such as, for example, flexibility services and demand-side response, which could come from industrial and also residential customers. So this would be a first perspective. The second one is of course around interoperability, which is a key. So if we have different exchange platforms, the fact that they are interoperable between them and that the data are standardized is also very important. And then there was a suggestion in the questions by a participant that this data hub could also serve for some grid planning and grid management topic. Indeed, as it was shown in the conclusions, it could be a cluster of new functionalities to have some data here helping the grid planning and the grid congestion management.
Yeah, that's something we certainly also see. If you have all the smart meter data available for DSO, for example, it could help very easily to improve the grid planning. So that's a benefit we generally see in that type of data being available to DSOs and also TSOs to make better predictions about how the demand might also develop, also have a better understanding of how much distributed generation there actually is, about the profiles of the distributed generation. So having that data available certainly can improve a lot of processes also in the planning side. The question is then, of course, how you set it up. If that is that data is just available to the DSO, or if it's or TSO, if that's the functionality on the hub and so on. That could then again be or should be decided in, I guess, in each country. So we would not want to mandate a right solution there. I just would like to point out that this data, of course, is extremely valuable also for this kind of applications.
And as the last questions to pick up, there is there is an interesting question around, so do you think that end customers like households will have access to the wholesale energy market day ahead intraday anytime soon? Is there any signal from the EU that points in this direction? So indeed, this is an interesting question because the clean energy package today gives a lot of provision around prosumers, customer empowerment in markets, and demand-side response development, self-generation, etc. Giving also a clear trend that we need to integrate these actors more into the markets, which are today very focused on bigger customers. So we believe, and as I said a bit earlier, and it was said also during the presentation by THEMA, that we need to strive for more integration and to bridge the gap between retail and wholesale, and to allow so either directly or through new actors such as aggregators, to allow distributed resources to participate also to wholesale markets. And it also responds in a sense to another questions about merging or working together between TSOs and DSOs on flexibility services. Indeed, this could be also a perspective that TSOs and DSOs, and they are already working on it today, to identify where are the flexibilities on the grid, and in which market these flexibilities should be traded in order to value them at the most, so to bring value to the customers and also to respond to the grid and the system needs, such as congestion management and balancing. Do you want to add anything, Theodor and Osmund?
We generally agree. So the clean energy package indeed has quite a few statements in that go exactly in that direction. We did not analyze in detail how the wholesale market should be set up with respect to how large you have to be to participate directly. But I think it's not so much. I mean, that's a question about what you mean by access to the wholesale market. Does it have to be direct access by the consumer or prosumer, or do you have some management party, basically like an aggregator, that does it for you and optimizes your site? And I think that is a more likely development, without saying if it's the right or wrong way to go. But I think that's a more likely development in the near future. And we also see, for example, in the Nordics, in Denmark and Norway, we have spot index contracts. So you really get the spot market price for your electricity consumption for each hour. And you then pay a small management fee on top of that. And basically we can compare the contracts that different suppliers give you exactly by this management fee that you have as a markup on the contract. So you are basically buying directly in the wholesale market, but you're just not really doing it yourself. You have somebody doing it for you. I think that is the most likely and already happening development. How it will change with the rules about direct access to the wholesale market, that I think is not what we looked at.
So now we are running out of time, and I see that so it's already noon. So we are going to close this webinar. There are so some questions which has not been answered. So we are going to gather them and to answer to you directly in order to continue the debate. I would like to thank a lot Theodor and Osmund from THEMA for their great presentation, and to thank you all for attending this webinar today. So I wish you a very nice day. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye. Bye.